All right, welcome. It's just now noon Pacific time. We're letting folks in the audience come in. I'm seeing some familiar faces, some old friends, and also some new names. Welcome. Uh, Looks like we're still climbing. I give special points to all of you who are just joining us right on time. That's very impressive. Great. Great turnout. We're 40, 42, 43. We're going to give everyone a few minutes before we start with Dr. Brad Wilcox. So stay patient and lay down some ground rules. If you want to chat and make your opinion known, you can just hit the chat function at the bottom of your bar. And if you have a question for Dr. Wilcox, please submit it using the Q&A function. That's what I'll be monitoring. I'll be selecting questions towards the second half of today's program. So if you have a question, use the Q&A function. And if you just want to chat and let your opinion be known, you can chat. We have our first comment. They said the video looks good. Well, that's good to hear. So we'll leave about 30 seconds for our stragglers. But excellent job on the 45 of you who have come in right on time. It's going to be a great hour. If you have a coffee, we can cheers at distance. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Again, if you are just coming in, we already have the first contentious comment from Ed. Marriage is a bourgeois convention. We'll get to that. That's actually, that's something we should definitely discuss. So if you have a question, hit it in the Q&A. If you have just a chat, you want to make nice comments or trolling comments, either one, you can do that in the chat function. So it's my pleasure to have the second Wealth and Poverty Forum conversation with the great Dr. Brad Wilcox of the University of Virginia and the Institute for Family Studies. This is an issue that, if you look at the theme of wealth and poverty, that in my view is absolutely central. I think that there is no more important topic, no more important social construction, no more important unit than the family. And yet it's something that is really not discussed nearly as much as it should be. It's something that has really bizarrely developed into a taboo. It's taken on political overtones and kind of partisan connotations that I think is really detrimental to something that every human being throughout time, throughout geography, has experienced, the kind of complex but deeply important dynamic of family. And to give you an idea of the format for today's discussion, we're going to have Dr. Wilcox give a short presentation, 15, 20 minutes about this topic. Then I'll be engaging in some questions that I've been dying to ask Dr. Wilcox, and then we'll also take questions from all of you. So again, without further ado, we're going to introduce Dr. Brad Wilcox. For those of you who are just coming in now, he'll be speaking, and then we'll take questions. So thank you. Thanks for coming, and welcome, and really looking forward to your remarks.
Chris, well, thanks very much for having me here today. It's a pleasure to be with you talking about marriage and family life. And I want to kind of begin by just, mentioning that I think there's a lot of talk out there about family diversity and about kind of the importance of celebrating family diversity. My colleagues and I at the Institute for Family Studies did a survey late last year, looking at Californians' attitudes towards family life, for instance. And what we found in that survey was that 85% of college-educated Californians said that they wanted to sort of celebrate family diversity. This is about 20 percentage points more than their fellow citizens in California. Now, what's striking here about this is that it's sort of, I think, emblematic of the way in which our elites in this country, including California, take a kind of a more progressive posture in public when it comes to sort of talking about and thinking about family life, again, in the public square. We also kind of see this dynamic playing out, in corporate America. For instance, there is a statement from Bright Horizons, which is the leading provider of employer-sponsored childcare in the U.S. on this whole topic. And they said that we need to recognize and acknowledge family diversity, both for the purpose of understanding and appreciating other people's circumstances, as well as for the sake of personal pride, unquote, for children. Family is, quote, any group of people who love and take care of each other, unquote. And in all of this, Bright Horizons aims to sort of help children and families, quote, recognize that happy people spring from any loving familial unit, unquote. So what's happening here, right, is that the idea is that it's not the structure of the family that matters. It's not marriage that matters. It's the love that's found in any kind of family form. And then we can see, going to the sort of pop culture, for instance, someone like Katy Perry saying, recently, I don't need a dude. We're living in the future. We don't need anything. I'm not anti-men. I love men. But there is an option if someone doesn't present himself, unquote, kind of talking about her approach to family formation. So the point I'm making here again is that our elites kind of embrace in public this idea that no particular family form is better than another, that marriage is not essential or important, and that we should be kind of celebrating the variety of family forms that we see around us, today in the US. But what's curious about this reality, right, is that our elites are not practicing what they're preaching when it comes to family life. We sort of see play out here is what David Brooks has called kind of inverted hypocrisy. And what he means by that, and what I mean by that, is they're actually practicing marriage-related virtues in their private lives that they are not celebrating in public. It's just a sort of very curious phenomenon where they're kind of talking left on family issues, but walking right in their own family lives. And so when we actually did this California survey and a California report on family life in California, what we found, for instance, is that in some of the most elite neighborhoods in Silicon Valley and Southern California, including the neighborhood that surrounds Holly Drive, which is the drive that cuts right through the northern half of Hollywood, there are virtually no single parent families, right? So this is, this neighborhood around Holly Drive sits just north of Hollywood Drive. And again, it's a neighborhood where, virtually no single parent families can be found. So you have, a place, in this case, Hollywood's often celebrating family diversity, celebrating any number of freedoms that are in tension with living strong and stable family life. Actually, when it comes down to sort of how they're doing things, actually living a much more marriage-centered lifestyle. So, I think one question here is why, despite their kind of public support for family diversity, do so many of our college-educated Americans, so many of our elites actually today live a pretty conventional family life in their own personal lives? And I think what's happening here is there's grown a recognition, since the excesses of the divorce revolution in the 1970s, there's grown a recognition that stable marriage is prudentially, pragmatically, the best path for adults, and even more so the best path, for their kids. And Americans of all stripes and of all educations, all class backgrounds, love their kids. And there's kind of been a kind of a tacit, in some cases an explicit recognition, in the last few decades among more educated Americans that their kids are more likely to flourish if they can kind of keep things together on the home front. And of course, this insight is backed up by a ton of social science. Just today, my blog, Family Studies, had a piece by Kay Heimowitz, and she's writing up a new article by the UCLA economist Melanie Wasserman. And in this article, Wasserman is talking about the ways in which kids, particularly boys, benefit from being raised by their own married biological parents. And so she talks about how when it comes to education, when it comes to behavior, when it comes to their performance in the workplace as young adults, kids, particularly boys, are more likely to be flourishing in education and behavior in the workplace when they have the benefit of their own married parents growing up. So what does that mean kind of in terms of concrete statistics? Well, the statistics tell us that young adults from intact families are about 50% more likely to graduate from college than their peers who don't have an intact family in their background. What's interesting here too is that the effect of family structure is particularly powerful in predicting attending and graduating from an elite college. So that effect is even stronger when it comes to looking at your odds of graduating from an elite college, like Stanford or Duke or UVA or, Princeton or Harvard in the US. We also see too that when it comes to things like, having trouble with the law and ending up in prison or in jail by the time you hit your 30s, boys who are raised outside of an intact family, apart from their father, are almost 2 times more likely to spend some time in prison or in jail. Likewise, girls who are raised apart from an intact married family, apart from their father, are also about twice as likely to have a child outside of wedlock compared to their peers who grew up in an intact family with mom and dad there on the home front. And then when it comes to looking at people's sort of success in terms of, comes to looking at kids' odds of flourishing or floundering in school, we see that the gap between boys and girls is larger for boys from non-intact families than from intact families. So one study from the University of Chicago found that there was a 10 percentage point gap in school suspensions for girls and boys from intact married families, but a 26 percentage point gap for boys and girls from single mother households. So it gives you kind of a sense of how these dynamics, when it comes to school and crime and work, are often more consequential for our boys than for our girls. So that gives you kind of a quick sense of some of the statistics that are kind of revolving around this issue. And what I've been talking about just now, of course, is sort of how these dynamics affect individual kids, individual boys and girls. But I think we often have difficulty when it comes to this topic and to this issue to sort of see the ways in which what happens in our own homes doesn't just affect our own children. It affects the kids in the houses, just down the street from us, just up the street from us. And so what I'm saying here is there are a lot of externalities that sort of intersect with what's happening in our families. We know that, for instance, one of the strongest predictors of divorce is whether or not our friends and family members have gotten divorced. And so, if you're struggling in your marriage, as most of us do at some point, and, your older sister has gotten divorced and your best friend has gotten divorced, odds are you're going to get divorced. By contrast, if your older sister has figured out a way to work through this marital difficulty, if your best friend has navigated that, that deep disappointment, successfully moved on to forge a stronger marriage, down the road, you're going to kind of confront that marital difficulty oftentimes and resolve it by kind of moving forward and building a stronger and a stable marriage kind of moving forward. So that's an example of how this is work done by Nicholas Christakis at Yale, for instance, on divorce and networks, on how kind of what's happening in our homes is shaped by what's happening in our networks among our friends, our family members, our neighborhoods, our religious communities and whatnot. And then we also see too, that when it comes to sort of thinking about kind of the economic issues that you mentioned at the beginning of this session, work done by the Harvard economist Raj Chetty and his colleagues from Harvard and Berkeley tells us that one of the strongest predictors at the sort of community level, at the neighborhood level, is the family structure. So in looking at communities across the US, for instance, in terms of which communities predicted rags to riches mobility, that is coming from a family at the 20th percentile economically to moving into the top 20th percentile as an adult. So again, sort of this rags to riches, classic American dream trajectory. What Chetty and his team found was that, quote, the strongest and most robust predictor of this kind of mobility is the fraction of children with single parents. In other words, in communities like the Salt Lake City metro area, poor kids are much more likely to realize the American dream as adults, to break out of poverty. By contrast, in communities like, for instance, the Atlanta metro area, where there are many more single parent families, kids are much more likely to get stuck in a cycle of poverty as they move into adulthood. And what Chetty's work is sort of suggesting to us is that one important part of the story is whether or not kids, particularly boys, to be frank, are surrounded by a lot of, men, fathers, husbands, kind of looking out for the character of the neighborhood, looking out for the character of the kids, and doing their part to socialize, discipline, and direct the welfare of the kids, in their local community. So again, my point here is we kind of think about how these issues play out is to recognize that they affect both our kids and our communities. And on the economic front, I also have done some work with Robert Lerman and with Joseph Price that indicates that one of the strongest predictors of growth at the state level is the share of kids being raised in married parent families in the states across the US. So again, you kind of can see how what's happening in our homes doesn't just stay in our homes, to kind of take the Las Vegas logo and kind of turn it on its head. It spreads out into our neighborhoods, our communities, and even our states in ways that affect the sort of social and educational and economic welfare of our larger communities. So you also asked, kind of in the sort of the questions that you wanted to sort of guide our discussion today. What is it about the intact family that matters? And when you have this conversation with people on the left side of the political aisle, in the academy and in the media, they often think this is really all about money. And we do know that married families today are typically more affluent than unmarried families are, and so isn't this all about money? And I certainly want to acknowledge right here and now that is a big part of the story. My mentor at Princeton, Sarah McLennan, found that about half of the family structure effects that she analyzed could be kind of parsed off to financial advantages that married families tended to have, or two-parent families tended to have. Well, it's important to note here, right, that if you get and stay married, generally speaking, your income and assets are going to be larger than they will if you have kids on your own without the benefit of a spouse, or if you get divorced. And we see dramatic declines in obviously in property in the wake of divorce, as people often have to sell a home, have to pay lawyers, have to navigate the costs of managing two households, et cetera. So, it's important to acknowledge when you sort of address the money issue, that stable marriage itself tends to bring in more income and raise assets for families compared to the alternatives. But even beyond sort of the money piece, we obviously have in an intact married family two sets of hearts and minds where kids are just getting more, generally speaking, in the household on a day-to-day basis, more love, more attention, and more discipline from their two parents. It's also, of course, the way in which most civilizations have connected men to their kids. So it's a way that fathers are brought into the practical, the emotional, and the economic lives of their kids on a very real basis. It's not just a bourgeois thing, just to go to that earlier comment from, at the first minute today. It's really kind of a human thing, marriage is, that many, many civilizations, from the West to China, to India, to Egypt, they've all kind of come up with this institution to kind of bring stability, direction, purpose, and solidarity to adult relationships and to relations between kids and adults. And then the sort of other point I'd make here is that, there's a lot you could say about sort of marriage and the welfare of kids, but it's important too to note that you have in a stable marriage, two sets of kin, typically, who are brought into the picture, two sets of grandparents who are helping with things like childcare, who are helping with things like private school tuition or college tuition, who are helping with, as in our case, putting on a back porch to the family home. So there are ways in which a stable two-parent family is sort of able to kind of build a kind of village around the kids that's deeply meaningful in practical, financial, and sort of in profound emotional ways. I mean, I'm always amazed at how much my kids love seeing their cousins from both sides, my side and my wife's side of the family. And love being a part of, Christmas and Thanksgiving celebrations that bring together, both sides of the family. And where there's no resentments, there's no animus, there's just a level of sort of psychic security, I think, is sort of the phrase you could talk about here, that having stability, family stability anchored in marriage across the generations affords our kids. And the final thing I would just sort of say, though, in all of this is, what I'm not saying here is that being raised in a non-intact family is a death sentence. I was raised by a single mom. I think that I've turned out reasonably well. My sister is doing reasonably well. We've both been, married now more than 35 years between the two of us, and we have a lot of kids between the two of us. And we know plenty of people. I'm sure everyone on on this session knows plenty of people who've come from single parent families, for instance, who are flourishing today. So I want to acknowledge that reality. But I'm also a sociologist. And what I'm saying today, obviously, is that on average, kids and communities are more likely to flourish when they are anchored by stable married families. So why don't I stop there, Chris? And I know you've got some other questions we can work through, but that's kind of a quick way of summarizing how the culture, I think, is thinking about families in public oftentimes, and yet paradoxically how the science in economics, in sociology, and psychology really tends to show us that, in fact, the intact married family is kind of a gold standard for our kids and for our communities.
Yeah, that's great. And, I have a couple questions. And again, if you are just coming in, it looks like we're up to 61 attendees, which is great. If you have a question for Dr. Wilcox, just click Q&A in the bottom bar and submit your question. But, I'm particularly interested in, for a film that I directed that's coming out on PBS later this year about three of America's poorest cities. And I initially had thought of it in terms of economics, in terms of public policy. And then having spent, years going back and forth from these places, it was very obvious very quickly talking with people within these communities that the family issue is central not only to the kind of economic fortunes of these communities, but really in a personal way. And I remember was in a jail reentry program, and a hardened kind of criminal gang member, one of the toughest guys in the room, breaks down crying. And he says, looking back on my life, I really needed my dad, and my dad was never there. And that moment really just crystallized this issue for me. And I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about what happens when the kind of traditional norm of intact families that was universal across racial groups, across economic groups, across geographic areas, what happens when that is really gone? And in this case, in the neighborhood in South Memphis, the zip code 38126, where I spent a lot of time, the single parent household rate was 92%. So out of 6,000 families, there were only 10 traditional nuclear families. What does the science say? What does your own research and intuition say? What are the consequences when you've really kind of in these pockets of persistent family inequality? What happens?
Yeah, that's a great question, Chris. And I think, the way that I've thought about this question has kind of revolved a lot around kind of the household story. And that is that in such a household, or in households in many of our most distressed neighborhoods, there is no father present. There's no one there to kind of, there's no couple there to sort of model sort of stability over the years, to kind of give people a sense of sort of how love long-term works, how you kind of navigate those tough times, how you how you forgive your spouse, how you love your spouse. And thinking too, in part based upon the work of David Autor at MIT and Melanie Wasserman, who I mentioned before at UCLA, how the lack of a male role model can be particularly debilitating, particularly destructive for boys who are growing up, without seeing a man kind of get up in the morning, go to work, come back, without seeing a man doing the dishes, without seeing a man, changing the diapers, without seeing a man kind of just being there, for them. And so you're kind of what you think in terms of what it means to be a man, I think can be distorted in ways that are destructive. Now, moving beyond that point though, and what's interesting about this new study that just came out from Melanie Wasserman at UCLA is she's talking about what's happening outside of the household in these neighborhoods, and about the way in which when you kind of bring a lot of families and a lot of kids and a lot of boys together in a neighborhood and in a school where fathers are really not that involved, not present oftentimes, what's happening then is that there are many more opportunities for the boys to get involved with the gang. There are fewer reasons to sort of behave in school, and it's kind of this negative peer effect that we see happening. Again, it's particularly detrimental for lower income boys, because both in their household but also outside of their household, they just don't see a lot of men who are combining work, marriage, and fatherhood in constructive ways. They just don't have a model, nor do they have kind of men who are acting to sort of ensure that the teenage boys are behaving themselves, and staying out of trouble. And so at the neighborhood level, in fact, my colleagues, Joe Price and I, and some others found that, one of the top 3 predictors at the neighborhood level of incarceration in the US, using Raschetti's data, is the share of single parent families in a neighborhood. So boys who are growing up in communities without 2 parents are just much more likely to kind of end up on that trajectory to prison or to jail. So hope that answers your question. But I think the movie or the TV series that you've put together probably is sort of showing us in part how both what's happening in the household, but also what's happening outside the household when you don't have a lot of married dads in the picture, can be pretty heartbreaking.
Yeah, it is. And I think, the irony, and this brings me to my next question, is that if you talk to folks that are experiencing this at the community level and individual level, to them, the problem is very clear in many cases. They say, it's really hard. I have 2 kids. I'm on my own. My child's father is in and out of jail. And from the interviews that I had done for the project, probably more than 1,000 interviews total, this seems to be front and center in people's minds because it's that universal human kind of longing for family connection, stability, security. But as you've suggested, the rhetoric among the elites, who essentially don't suffer from the consequences of their rhetoric, don't experience the loss of family, is quite different. And I'm hoping you can talk about this. And it's kind of a line of thinking that I have been reading about, but I think deserves more attention. What is the argument, let's say dating back 100 years to kind of Marxist or socialist, moving forward now to the progressive? What is the argument against the family? Can you kind of outline that argument and explain how that has affected our political life and social life?
Yeah, well, let me kind of turn it in a little bit of a different direction. That is, how do we kind of account for why progressives say one thing in public and do another thing in private when it comes, or our elites do one thing in public and another thing when it comes to their own private lives? And I think that there are a couple of things that help us to understand kind of this talking left pattern that we see in our public conversation. So the first point I'd make, obviously, is that, virtually all of us have had some kind of personal, encounter with, family breakdown of one sort or another. So we may have been raised by a single mother. We may have gotten divorced. Our best friend may have had a child outside of wedlock, any number of things. So I think that the sort of the reality of the family diversity on the ground, if you will, makes it, I think, makes it harder for us to sort of raise any kind of public standard around kind of the intact married family. That's, I think, part of the situation here. It's just, it can be personally and difficult and awkward to kind of have this conversation given what's happening, you know, on the ground. The second thing that I would say is that progressives tend to have this idea that sort of change in and of itself is a good thing, you know, and there's this sort of this idea that as the family has changed, and everyone would kind of acknowledge that reality, it's necessarily a good thing because change is good in the progressive worldview. I think that's part of the second point that I think is sort of, and this is particularly, of course, a view that has a lot of purchase in higher education, you know, and so more educated Americans, I think, are more inclined to embrace this progressive, progressive idea. The third thing that goes to this issue of freedom. And our country obviously has really kind of stressed the importance of the virtue of freedom. But I think freedom has come to be understood in the last half century as being something that kind of puts you at odds with sort of classic norms of restraint or duty or obligation in many different spheres of life, including in the family. And so I think we've kind of had this idea now that freedom means, you know, that you have the right and indeed almost the duty to do whatever you want to do when it comes to sort of marriage, parenthood, family life more generally. And so we can't really, raise any kind of, moral concerns with particular choices, lest we, be kind of puritanical prudes who, don't appreciate, the value of all the freedoms that we now enjoy today in this society. Of course, not recognizing that some people in this country pay a much bigger price for the way in which we've sort of exercised these freedoms in the last half century. And the final point I would make goes to your sort of question more directly, and that is, I think, sort of the ghost of Karl Marx hovers over our thinking and our conversations about family. And I can't tell you how many times journalists who have addressed this issue of family life, addressed this issue of the class divide that now confronts our country on marriage. So, basically today in America, a majority of college-educated Americans will marry and will stay married, whereas a majority of Americans who don't have a college degree will not be stably married over the course of their adult lives. And so when journalists and many academics think about this, it's just all thought about in terms of economics. And the family instability we see now among working class and poor Americans is simply kind of influenced here by kind of Marxist way of thinking and a sort of a superstructural expression of underlying economic dynamics. Okay, and there was a piece that Annie Lowrey wrote on the New York Times a while back, just sort of saying, you want to solve the marriage problem, basically solve poverty. So, and let me be clear. I mean, I think there is definitely an economics, story here playing out. One that I think sort of many kind of fusionist conservatives have not paid enough attention to, since the 1980s. So I don't want to deny the importance of economics, but I just want to sort of say that, look, in the 1930s, at the height of the greatest depression that we've at least experienced, for a very long time, there was no increase of any sort, really, of any market sort in divorce or in single parenthood or in family instability. So it's clearly the case that economics alone is not a sufficient explanation for what's happened to American families and to marriage, in the US since the 1960s. There is more going on here. There's more in terms of the culture, obviously, civil society, and public policy. And these things have all kind of acted together to make marriage less common in this country, and also to kind of deepen the divide between Americans who have that college degree and those who do not.
And following up on that, there's a number of questions that are asking about kind of, if you stratify the kind of the households and family structure, we have a question here about race, and my sense, working on this issue personally, having made a film largely on these themes, is that what started as a kind of racially stratified and disparate institution is now increasingly becoming more common everywhere. Can you walk us through the differences among racial groups, and then the trends that have been happening in the last 50 years?
So, we do see today that Asian Americans have the most stable families, followed by whites, followed then by Hispanics, and followed finally by African Americans. There's definitely kind of an ethnic and racial story to American family patterns. But as you mentioned, I think we've also seen, particularly since the 1980s, a growing class divide. So that Americans who don't have a college degree, or Americans who come from working class or poor backgrounds, be they, white or Hispanic or African American, are much more likely to be struggling today. And so, I'm sitting here in Charlottesville, Virginia, and, if I was to drive, 15 miles, really in any direction from my house right now, I would be kind of in predominantly working class white communities. And those communities are really struggling right now when it comes to non-marital childbearing, cohabitation, and family instability. And so it shows us this is not simply a racial issue anymore. There really is a class dynamic playing out here across racial and ethnic lines. And so we have to, I think about, why it is that Americans from a more working class background, for instance, experience a lot more family instability today than they did, in 1975 or 1955. Now, just to go a little bit further on that point, this is, I think, where, many kind of sort of classic conservatives have missed the boat. And I think they tend to talk about kind of the importance of culture. We need to kind of change the culture around family. And of course, I agree with that idea, but that's necessary but not sufficient, right? So the point here is, if you look at the work, for instance, of David Autor, again, at MIT, he has found that in the wake of the China trade shock in the early 2000s, we saw about a million American good-paying, stable manufacturing jobs just disappear. And this happened predominantly in the Midwest and in the South. And then he followed that research up with research on sort of patterns in marriage and family instability and single parenthood, and found a big spike in less marriage, more family instability, more single parenthood in those very same communities. This is clearly kind of an economic story here playing out that connects sort of what's happening in the family to what's happening in the economy. So again, I'm not a Marxist, but I think we have to understand here that the family instability we're now seeing emerge in any working class white communities is not simply a cultural phenomenon. It's not simply a civic phenomenon. It's also an economic phenomenon. As we kind of go forward, we need to sort of rebuild not just the culture, not just the civil society, but also need to rebuild our economy in ways that make it more supportive of decent paying, stable jobs for working class Americans.
I think that's an important point, and I think it really goes to the idea of almost family viability. So from an individual perspective, how viable is it if I have a high school degree and I'm living in Youngstown, Ohio, or Flint, Michigan, to be able to support a family, to provide for a family? I guess the flip side, and let's talk about some potential solutions. If Kelly asks, do mentoring programs by faith-based or other community support organizations help in addressing these issues? And I think the larger question there is there a way to re-norm societies and communities? And can you share any examples of success?
So great question. So what we see is that on the civic side, that Americans, including African Americans who regularly attend church services, for instance, are more likely to get married, for instance. They're more likely to have their kids in marriage. They're more likely to enjoy high quality marriages. So that's sort of an example of how, like, for instance, religion matters for marriage in America. And we've seen recently an initiative in Jacksonville, Florida. It was called the Culture of Freedom Initiative that J.P. DeGance was spearheading, where they kind of brought a variety of institutions, churches, nonprofits. They had a media campaign in Jacksonville, Florida as well, which has about 1 million residents, all kind of revolving around kind of the value of marriage. And they saw divorce come down by about 20% over the course of 3 years. Now, thankfully, actually, divorce has been coming down across the US, but sort of the rate of decline was even more sort of salient for Jacksonville than it was for the country and the state as a whole. So I think that the Culture of Freedom Initiative had some impact on stabilizing marriage in Jacksonville. So these are kind of discrete examples of, you know, ways in which I think a variety of civic institutions can strengthen marriage. But I think kind of for the country as a whole, and this is definitely a tall order, what we need is for our elites in higher education, the media, and Hollywood to recognize that what they're often personally benefiting from in terms of a stable marriage matters not just for them and for their kids, but also for their communities and for their country. And I would love to see, more news articles, more movies, more songs, not sort of presenting a rose-colored view of marriage, obviously, but a realistic one that's truthful and that gives people the sense of, how much stable family lives matter for our kids.
Great. And this is a great question that just came in from Angela. She asks, can you talk a little about why the economics makes marriage less desirable but not childbearing? What makes marrying someone undesirable but having kids with them okay? And I think that's makes a crucial distinction. There's been a separation of those two institutions that were at one time quite closely tied together. What are your thoughts and any kind of research on that question?
Yeah, well, I think when it comes to sort of marriage, we've raised the bar a great deal in terms of what we expect from, marriage and from our spouse. We've kind of embraced, in some ways, a more soulmate model of marriage where you kind of expect like a very strong kind of intense emotional relationship. We've also, as Andrew Cherlin has noted, he's a sociologist at Johns Hopkins, we've kind of embraced a kind of capstone model of marriage, where it's not just sort of the soulmate idea, but it's also kind of the idea that you have to have kind of a middle-class lifestyle before you go ahead and tie the knot. And so that makes people's willingness to sort of enter, marriage less frequent among working class and poor Americans. We don't have the same, kind of standard when it comes to having a child. People obviously, feel like they should, have a kid whenever they want one. And they don't necessarily think, given the cultural shifts we've been talking about, that having a ring on their finger or a partner in the picture is necessary or correct or best or ideal. And so, they go ahead and have a child, although often those kids are kids that are being they're not planning to have. They just, they're in a relationship and get pregnant and have the child. So the norms around kind of marriage and parenthood have moved in ways that decrease that connection, since the 60s. What I mean by that, again, is that we expect more and more emotionally, in some ways economically, from marriage, and we expect less in terms of how you enter parenthood. And that explains why about 39% of kids are born outside of marriage. Now, that's been sort of the pattern really from the late 60s to about 2008. But I do think that this sort of calculus is changing since the Great Recession. I think it's going to change even more since the COVID recession. And what we're seeing actually is that unmarried women are having fewer kids outside of marriage since the Great Recession. And I think what's happened is that people are becoming more cautious. Women are becoming more cautious. And so as we kind of go forward, actually, I think going to see an increase in the share of kids who are born in marriage and raised in stable married families. And that's in many ways good news, But as I mentioned to you before, our public session today, I think the bad news here is that we may see a kind of Japan pattern emerging in the US, where many young adults, a large minority of young adults, never marry and never have kids. And I think that pattern would be more common moving forward among working class, poor, and secular Americans. So there's obviously both an economic and a cultural point there, who have less opportunities and less normative pressure to seek out both marriage and parenthood.
Yeah, that's quite interesting, and I almost wonder in the kind of, if we play that out forward, I've heard the argument that it seemed almost preposterous to me at the time, but over the years has become more plausible, is that increasingly family is a luxury good. I mean, it's essentially a kind of class-based luxury good that has all of these preconditions that it's never had before, and is culturally supported only at that kind of higher level. Is that a potential future? And if so, what's being lost?
Yeah, we're already seeing this. And what got me thinking about this in part, this idea has been talked about, in many, many circles on the marriage front. But I saw a study about 2 years ago from Scandinavia showing that childlessness was rising the most in Scandinavia among working class Scandinavians, not upper class. And that was kind of a shift. And so I think we may be seeing the same dynamic playing out in the US in coming years. What's lost here, of course, is that both marriage and parenthood give our lives meaning, direction, purpose, a sense of solidarity, both symbolically and practically. And if you look again at Japan, what's happened there is that there's now kind of a generation of older Japanese Americans who are living and dying alone. There's a harrowing New York Times story on this whole phenomenon about 2 years ago, but just, so many older Japanese people are just living in apartments, no one's visiting them. They die, their bodies rot. There are companies in Japan that specialize in cleaning out the apartments of older Japanese people who've died and not been found for weeks and months, because no one was there for them. I mean, this is the thing. People I don't think appreciate really that. I mean, there are also, of course, there are real profound economic impacts, the profound political impacts in terms of the sustainability of, of our expenditures and things like, Medicare and Social Security. But at the human level, I think we're in danger of having a whole generation of young adults today growing up as what the Chinese call bare branches, where there's no kin for them, basically. There's no spouse, there's no children. And, if there are a few people like this in a larger extended family, not a big deal, because you have siblings and parents and, nieces and nephews. But if you've got a large minority of people who don't have a spouse or children, that presents, I think, profound problems, particularly in the middle and especially the later stages of your adult life.
Great. So I'm going to batch together a couple of the questions that I think are hitting on a single theme. A lot of folks are asking about the policy implications, both on the negative side. Is there a marriage tax penalty for families? Is there, the kind of old style AFDC, Aid to Families with Dependent Children programs? Did that lead to the kind of separation of families or kind of the prevention of stable family units? But fast forward to now, if you could change any one public policy and you had the magic wand ability in order to increase the health and viability of families, what would you do?
So I think that we had a perfect storm in the 60s and 70s that kind of began to put us on this road to both the retreat from marriage and this marriage divide. And what we had, of course, was that the culture became much more accommodating of a kind of me first approach to married life, family life more generally, rather than a family first approach, which I think had prevailed before in important ways, and it wasn't perfect, obviously. Politically, we had a lot of welfare programs that tended to kind of penalize marriage and de-emphasize the importance of dad being there practically to support the family. And economically, starting really in the 70s, we saw a lot of working class jobs, disappear. Decent paying, stable working class jobs disappear. So, all three of these things have kind of coalesced. And so how do we kind of go forward and bridge this marriage gap and revive the fortunes of marriage and family? And I would say three things. One is on the cultural front, we need to kind of stand up and basically communicate, proclaim the value of marriage. And I think in particularly the success sequence is one good way to do that, where we're kind of telling our young adults, in middle school, high school, and in their early 20s, that there is still today a sequence that really dramatically increases your odds of realizing the American dream. And that sequence is, getting some kind of education, preferably either a college degree or a vocational degree of some sort, working full-time in your early 20s, and then getting married before having any kids. If you follow those three things in terms of education, work, and marriage, your odds of being in poverty by the time you hit your late 20s or your 30s are just 3%, pretty minimum odds of being poor. And your odds of being in the middle class or higher are 86%. So that's the cultural piece I'd want to communicate, in schools and in a public campaign. The second thing I'd want to do is to address on the educational side of things, the way in which we tend to fail kids, particularly boys in high school who are not on the college track. And, even today, a majority of Americans will not get a four-year degree. That's particularly true, obviously, for young men in America today. And yet we don't do much in our local public schools to really kind of give kids a good vocational track when it comes to things like, IT, advanced manufacturing, healthcare, or, any, plumbing, et cetera. And so I think we could do a lot more to retool our schools to be more like Germany, where they do a really good vocational track. And then that would give, many of your young adults a better financial foundation in their 20s to go ahead and get married and to stay married. And the third and final thing that I would do is to eliminate the marriage penalty in our social welfare programs like Medicaid, for instance, food stamps. We have actually addressed the marriage penalty in most of our income taxes that, hit sort of upper class Americans. And so for most of our income taxes, what you see is a different bracket for singles and marrieds that basically doesn't penalize you for getting married in most scenarios. We've done really nothing to address the marriage penalties that exist for the bottom half of American society, economically speaking. And today, working class couples whose income is between like $25,000 and $50,000 are the ones most likely to be hit with big penalties when it comes to things like Medicaid, food stamps, childcare subsidies. And so I think we should basically restructure our social welfare programs in ways that would minimize that penalty and make it clear to people that, you're not going to lose, for instance, your health care if you go ahead and tie the knot and you have got kids. I was talking to a couple here in Virginia a little while ago, and, two beautiful little daughters. He works in IT. She's at home with the kids, but they weren't married. I'm like, what's going on here? And he's like, well, we sat down at the kitchen table. We were just sort of, running the numbers, and we realized we would lose Medicaid, and Medicaid's covering, the mom and the two daughters. Wow. And he doesn't have health insurance at his company. And so here's an example of where, our programs unintentionally, have this sort of perverse effect of discouraging marriage for working class couples today. And that's got to end. So those are three things I think could be helpful here in strengthening marriage and in bridging this marriage divide. But that's just a start. I do think we have to recognize that the fertility rate this year, and even more so next year in the wake of this COVID-induced recession, is going to be lower than it's ever been in American history. Probably around 1.6 next year, maybe lower than that. This is just, we're entering into new territory here when it comes to fertility in the US. And so I think we have to think a lot more about our cultural cues, our civic institutions, and our public policies in terms of making this country a much more family-friendly one than it currently is.
And I'm going to jump in with my own final question, and your discussion as on the kind of public policy approach has made me think of the universal basic income, which is an idea that has supporters on the left, supporters on the right, everyone from Andrew Yang to Charles Murray. And I think, I'd be curious if kind of hypothetically the existing kind of welfare state apparatus and policy regime was replaced by an unconditional basic income of, let's say, $1,000 a month. There's no marriage penalty. In fact, if you have two people, you've essentially doubled your universal basic income on the positive side. But then on the negative side, there might be disincentives to work. There might be disincentives to participate in kind of the civic fabric. Have you thought much about the UBI and its relationship to family? And if so, what were your kind of tentative conclusions?
Yeah, no, I am very skeptical about the UBI. I mean, I do worry about, the way in which people would be getting, money for nothing. And, one of the lessons of the last half century is that having a job, particularly for men, is integral to people's sense of self-satisfaction, their identity, their purpose. It tends to give their lives a structure that's really important. We actually see among men who are unemployed, they are much less likely to actually do housework if they're married, for instance, than their fellow male peers who are employed. So there's something, particularly I think for men, that's just really, and I don't think we fully understand exactly why this is the case, but men who are not working just tend to do horribly. And so my concern with the UBI is that we're going to be just basically giving a lot of men, particularly, a reason to, to stay in their parents' basement or live in a group home, and not really kind of get out there and be productive. So I don't think the UBI is the answer kind of going forward, but I do think we need to think about newer ideas. For instance, ideas like having some kind of job, subsidy for people who are earning below the median, that would make work pay more, and would also kind of go towards, pushing us more in the direction of kind of a family wage. So that's an idea that Oren Cass has obviously talked about. And what I like too about Oren's approach is that basically the left tends to talk about redistribution, and the right tends to talk about reduced regulation. And yet neither of these two approaches are doing enough to sort of think about how is the labor market functioning or not functioning in ways to strengthen families and communities. And I think we can debate about the merits of his particular approach, but I think that the sort of the perspective that he's articulating in that way is what's needed. That is, how can we make our labor market more friendly towards working class Americans, working class families, and working class communities? And if we can do that, that'll be part of the answer here.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I think that, whereas UBI disincentivizes connection to work, something like a negative income tax or wage supplement or subsidy actually does the opposite, incentivizing people to work. And, I'd just like to close in the 60 seconds that we have remaining. This has flown by. And thank you so much for everyone attending and your questions. We had great retention. Actually, everyone who came stayed through the whole hour. So we're grateful for that. But I really, truly do, as I said at the beginning, this is the critical issue. If you care about families, if you care about the future of the United States, if you care about issues of wealth and poverty, it all really starts here. And I think it's great to get your perspective. We're getting very complimentary comments flooding in the comments box. And I just think that it's such an important issue, and really appreciate you spending the hour with us and answering questions. And, if those of you who are attending have any further questions, feel free to email me directly. I'm just crufo@discovery.org. I hope I can answer your questions. If not, I'll forward them to Dr. Wilcox. But thanks again. Your voice is essential. And I hope that the message can spread. So great hour. Thank you everyone so much. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Chris. Appreciate it.